Chapter 2 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga. The Man of Property. By John Galsworthy. Chapter 2. Old Jolyon Goes to the Opera. At 5 o'clock the following day, old Jolyon sat alone, a cigar between his lips, and on a table by his side a cup of tea. He was tired, and before he had finished his cigar he fell asleep. A fly settled on his hair. His breathing sounded heavy in the drowsy silence. His upper lip, under the white moustache, puffed in and out. From between the fingers of his veined and wrinkled hand, the cigar, dropping on the empty hearth, burnt itself out. The gloomy little study, with windows of stained glass to exclude the view, was full of dark green velvet and heavily carved mahogany, a suite of which old Jolyon was wont to say, "Shouldn't wonder if it made a big price some day." It was pleasant to think that in the after-life he could get more for things than he had given. In the rich brown atmosphere, peculiar to back rooms in the mansion of a Forsyte, the Rembrandtesque effect of his great head, with its white hair, against the cushion of his high-backed seat, was spoiled by the moustache, which imparted a somewhat military look to his face. An old clock that had been with him since before his marriage, 40 years ago, kept with its ticking a jealous record of the seconds slipping away for ever from its old master. He had never cared for this room, hardly going into it from one year's end to another, except to take cigars from the Japanese cabinet in the corner, and the room now had its revenge. His temples, curving like thatches over the hollows beneath, his cheekbones and chin, all were sharpened in his sleep, and there had come upon his face the confession that he was an old man. He woke. June had gone. James had said he would be lonely. James had always been a poor thing. He recollected with satisfaction that he had bought that house over James's head. Serve him right for sticking at the price. The only thing the fellow thought of was money. Had he given too much, though? It wanted a lot of doing to. He dared say he would want all his money before he had done with this affair of June's. He ought never to have allowed the engagement. She had met this Bosinney at the house of Baines, and Bildeboy, the architects. He believed that Baines, whom he knew, bit of an old woman, was the young man's uncle by marriage. After that she'd been always running after him, and when she took a thing into her head there was no stopping her. She was continually taking up with lame ducks of one sort or another. This fellow had no money, but she must needs become engaged to him, a harum-scarum, unpractical chap who would get himself into no end of difficulties. She had come to him one day in her slapdash way and told him, and, as if it were any consolation, she had added, "He's so splendid, he's often lived on cocoa for a week." "And he wants you to live on cocoa too." "Oh no, he's getting into the swim now." Old Jolyon had taken his cigar from under his white moustaches, stained by coffee at the edge, and looked at her, that little slip of a thing who had got such a grip of his heart. He knew more about swims than his granddaughter, but she, having clasped her hands on his knees, rubbed her chin against him, making a sound like a purring cat. And, knocking the ash off his cigar, he had exploded in nervous desperation. "You're all alike. You won't be satisfied till you've got what you want. If you must come to grief, you must. I wash my hands of it." So he had washed his hands of it, making the condition that they should not marry until Bosinney had at least 400 a year. "I shan't be able to give you very much," he had said, a formula to which June was not unaccustomed. Perhaps this what's-his-name will provide the cocoa." He had hardly seen anything of her since it began. Bad business! He had no notion of giving her a lot of money to enable a fellow he knew nothing about to live on in idleness. He had seen that sort of thing before. No good ever came of it. Worst of all, he had no hope of shaking her resolution. She was as obstinate as a mule, always had been from a child. He didn't see where it was to end. They must cut their coat according to their cloth. He would not give way till he saw young Bosinney with an income of his own. That June would have trouble with the fellow was as plain as a pikestaff. He had no more idea of money than a cow. As to this rushing down to Wales to visit the young man's aunts, he fully expected they were old cats. And, motionless, old Jolyon stared at the wall. But for his open eyes he might have been asleep. The idea of supposing that young cub Soames could give him advice! He had always been a cub with his nose in the air. He would be setting up as a man of property next, with a place in the country. A man of property! Like his father, he was always nosing out bargains. A cold-blooded young beggar. He rose, and going to the cabinet, began methodically stocking his cigar case from a bundle fresh in. They were not bad at the price, but you couldn't get a good cigar nowadays. Nothing to hold a candle to those old superfinos of Hanson's and Bridger's. That was a cigar. The thought, like some stealing perfume, carried him back to those wonderful nights at Richmond, when after dinner he sat smoking on the terrace of the Crown and Sceptre with Nicholas Treffry, and Traquair, and Jack Herring, and Anthony Thornworthy. How good his cigars were then! Poor old Nick, dead, and Jack Herring, dead, and Traquair, dead of that wife of his, and Thornworthy, awfully shaky. No wonder with his appetite. Of all the company of those days, he himself alone seemed left, except Swithin, of course, and he so outrageously big there was no doing anything with him. Difficult to believe it was so long ago. He felt young still. Of all his thoughts, as he stood there counting his cigars, this was the most poignant, the most bitter. With his white head and his loneliness, he had remained young and green at heart. And those Sunday afternoons on Hampstead Heath, when young Jolyon and he went for a stretch along the Spaniards' Road to Highgate, to Child's Hill, and back over the heath again, to dine at Jack Straw's castle. How delicious his cigars were then! And such weather! There was no weather now. When June was a toddler of 5, and every other Sunday he took her to the Zoo, away from the society of those two good women, her mother and her grandmother, and at the top of the bear den baited his umbrella with buns for her favourite bears. How sweet his cigars were then! Cigars! He had not even succeeded in outliving his palate, the famous palate that in the '50s men swore by, and speaking of him said, "Forsyte's the best palate in London." The palate that in a sense had made his fortune, the fortune of the celebrated tea men, Forsyte and Treffry, whose tea, like no other man's tea, had a romantic aroma, the charm of a quite singular genuineness. About the house of Forsyte and Treffry in the city had clung an air of enterprise and mystery, of special dealings in special ships, at special ports, with special Orientals. He had worked at that business. Men did work in those days. These young pups hardly knew the meaning of the word. He had gone into every detail, known everything that went on, sometimes sat up all night over it. And he had always chosen his agents himself, prided himself on it. His eye for men, he used to say, had been the secret of his success, and the exercise of the masterful power of selection had been the only part of it all that he really liked. Not a career for a man of his ability. Even now, when the business had been turned into a limited liability company and was declining—he had got out of his shares long ago—he felt a sharp chagrin in thinking of that time. How much better he might have done! He would have succeeded splendidly at the bar. He had even thought of standing for Parliament. How often had not Nicholas Treffry said to him, You could do anything, Joe, if you weren't so damned careful of yourself. Ah, dear old Nick! Such a good fellow, but a rackety chap. The notorious Treffry. He had never taken any care of himself, so he was dead. Old Jolyon counted his cigars with a steady hand, and it came into his mind to wonder if perhaps he had been too careful of himself. He put the cigar case in the breast of his coat, buttoned it, and walked up the long flights to his bedroom, leaning on one foot and the other, and helping himself by the banister. The house was too big. After June was married, if she ever did marry this fellow, as he supposed she would, he would let it and go into rooms. What was the use of keeping half a dozen servants eating their heads off? The butler came to the ring of his bell, a large man with a beard, a soft tread, and a peculiar capacity for silence. Old Jolyon told him to put his dress clothes out. He was going to dine at the club. How long had the carriage been back from taking Miss June to the station? Since 2? Then let him come round at 6:30. The club which old Jolyon entered on the stroke of 7 was one of those political institutions of the upper middle class which have seen better days. In spite of being talked about, perhaps in consequence of being talked about, it betrayed a disappointing vitality. People had grown tired of saying that the disunion was on its last legs. Old Jolyon would say it too, yet disregarded the fact in a manner truly irritating to well-constituted clubmen. "Why do you keep your name on?" Swithin often asked him with profound vexation. "Why don't you join the Polyglot? You can't get a wine like our Heidsieck under 20 shillin' a bottle anywhere in London." And dropping his voice, he added, "There's only 500 dozen left. I drink it every night of my life." "I'll think of it," old Jolyon would answer; but when he did think of it, there was always the question of 50 guineas entrance fee, and it would take him 4 or 5 years to get in. He continued to think of it. He was too old to be a Liberal, had long ceased to believe in the political doctrines of his club, had even been known to allude to them as wretched stuff, and it afforded him pleasure to continue a member in the teeth of principles so opposed to his own. He had always had a contempt for the place, having joined it many years ago when they refused to have him at the Hotch-Potch, owing to his being in trade, as if he were not as good as any of them. He naturally despised the club that did take him. The members were a poor lot, many of them in the city, stockbrokers, solicitors, auctioneers, what not. Like most men of strong character, but not too much in originality, old Jolyon set small store by the class to which he belonged. Faithfully he followed their customs, social and otherwise, and secretly he thought them a common lot. Years and philosophy, of which he had had his share, had dimmed the recollection of his defeat at the Hotch-Potch, and now in his thoughts it was enshrined as the queen of clubs. He would have been a member all these years himself, but owing to the slipshod way his proposer, Jack Herring, had gone to work, they had not known what they were doing in keeping him out. Why, they had taken his son Joe at once, and he believed the boy was still a member. He had received a letter dated from there 8 years ago. He had not been near the disunion for months, and the house had undergone the piebald decoration which people bestow on old houses and old ships when anxious to sell them. Beastly colour, the smoking room, he thought. The dining room's good. Its gloomy chocolate, picked out with light green, took his fancy. He ordered dinner, and sat down in the very corner, at the very table perhaps. Things did not progress much at the Disunion, a club of almost radical principles, at which he and young Jolyon used to sit 25 years ago, when he was taking the latter to Drury Lane during his holidays. The boy had loved the theatre, and old Jolyon recalled how he used to sit opposite, concealing his excitement under a careful but transparent nonchalance. He ordered himself, too, the very dinner the boy had always chosen: soup, whitebait, cutlets, and a tart. Ah, if he were only opposite now! The two had not met for 14 years, and not for the first time during those 14 years. Old Jolyon wondered whether he had been a little to blame in the matter of his son. An unfortunate love affair with that precious flirt Danae Thornworthy, now Danae Pellew, Anthony Thornworthy's daughter, had thrown him on the rebound into the arms of June's mother. He ought perhaps to have put a spoke in the wheel of their marriage. They were too young. But after that experience of Jo's susceptibility, he had been only too anxious to see him married. And in 4 years the crash had come. To have approved his son's conduct in that crash was of course impossible. Reason and training, that combination of potent factors which stood for his principles, told him of this impossibility, and his heart cried out. The grim remorselessness of that business had no pity for hearts. There was June, the atom with the flaming hair, who had climbed all over him, twined and twisted herself about him, about his heart that was made to be the plaything and beloved resort of tiny helpless things. With characteristic insight, he saw he must now part with one or with the other. No half measures could serve in such a situation. In that lay its tragedy, and the tiny helpless thing prevailed. He would not run with the hare and hunt with the hounds, and so, to his son, he said good-bye. That good-bye had lasted until now. He had proposed to continue a reduced allowance to young Jolyon, but this had been refused, and perhaps that refusal had hurt him more than anything, for with it had gone the last outlet of his penned-in affection, and there had come such tangible and solid proof of rupture as only a transaction in property, a bestowal or refusal of such, could supply. His dinner tasted flat. His pint of champagne was dry and bitter stuff, not like the Veuve Clicquot's of old days. Over his cup of coffee he bethought him that he would go to the opera. In the Times, therefore—he had a distrust of other papers—he read the announcement for the evening. It was Fidelio. Mercifully not one of those new-fangled German pantomimes by that fellow Wagner. Putting on his ancient opera hat, which, with its brim flattened by use and huge capacity, looked like an emblem of greater days, and pulling out an old pair of very thin lavender kid gloves, smelling strongly of Russia leather from habitual proximity to the cigar case in the pocket of his overcoat, he stepped into a hansom. The cab rattled gaily along the streets, and old Jolyon was struck by their unwonted animation. The hotels must be doing a tremendous business, he thought. A few years ago there had been none of these big hotels. He made a satisfactory reflection on some property he had in the neighbourhood. It must be going up in value by leaps and bounds. What traffic! But from that he began indulging in one of those strange impersonal speculations so uncharacteristic of a Forsyte, wherein lay, in part, the secret of his supremacy among them. What atoms men were, and what a lot of them, and what would become of them all? He stumbled as he got out of the cab, gave the man his exact fare, walked up to the ticket office to take his stall, and stood there with his purse in his hand. He always carried his money in a purse, never having approved of that habit of carrying it loosely in the pockets, as so many young men did nowadays. The official leaned out, like an old dog from a kennel. "Why," he said in a surprised voice, "it's Mr. Jolyon Forsyte! So it is! Haven't seen you, sir, for years. Dear me, times aren't what they were. Why, you and your brother and that auctioneer, Mr. Traquair, and Mr. Nicholas Treffry, you used to have 6 or 7 stalls here, regular, every season. And how are you, sir? We don't get any younger." The colour in old Jolyon's eyes deepened. He paid his guinea. They had not forgotten him. He marched in, to the sounds of the overture, like an old war-horse to battle. Folding his opera hat, he sat down, drew out his lavender gloves in the old way, and took up his glasses for a long look round the house. Dropping them at last on his folded hat, he fixed his eyes on the curtain. More poignantly than ever, he felt that it was all over and done with him. Where were all the women, the pretty women, the house used to be so full of? Where was that old feeling in the heart as he waited for one of those great singers? Where that sensation of the intoxication of life, and of his own power to enjoy it all? the greatest opera-goer of his day. There was no opera now. That fellow Wagner had ruined everything. No melody left, nor any voices to sing it. Ah, the wonderful singers! Gone! He sat watching the old scenes acted, a numb feeling at his heart. From the curl of silver over his ear to the pose of his foot in its elastic-sided patent boot, there was nothing clumsy or weak about old Jolyon. He was as upright, very nearly, as in those old times when he came every night. His sight was as good, almost as good, but what a feeling of weariness and disillusion! He had been in the habit all his life of enjoying things, even imperfect things, and there had been many imperfect things. He had enjoyed them all with moderation, so as to keep himself young, but now he was deserted by his power of enjoyment, by his philosophy, and was left with this dreadful feeling that it was all done with. Not even the prisoners' chorus, nor Florian's song had the power to dispel the gloom of his loneliness. If Jo were only with him! The boy must be 40 by now. He had wasted 14 years out of the life of his only son, and Jo was no longer a social pariah. He was married. Old Jolyon had been unable to refrain from marking his appreciation of the action by enclosing his son a cheque for £500. The cheque had been returned in a letter from the hotchpotch, couched in these words: "My dearest father, your generous gift was welcome as a sign that you might think worse of me. I return it, but should you think fit to invest it for the benefit of the little chap, we call him Jolly, who bears our Christian and by courtesy our surname, I shall be very glad. I hope with all my heart that your health is as good as ever. Your loving son, Jo." The letter was like the boy. He had always been an amiable chap. Old Jolyon had sent this reply: "My dear Jo, the sum, £500, stands in my books for the benefit of your boy, under the name of Jolyon Forsyte, and will be duly credited with interest at 5%. I hope that you are doing well. My health remains good at present. With love, I am, your affectionate father, Jolyon Forsyte." And every year, on the 1st of January, he had added 100 and the interest. The sum was mounting up. Next New Year's Day it would be £1,500 odd, and it is difficult to say how much satisfaction he had got out of that yearly transaction. But the correspondence had ended. In spite of his love for his son, in spite of an instinct, partly constitutional, partly the result, as in thousands of his class, of the continual handling and watching of affairs, prompting him to judge conduct by results rather than by principle, there was at the bottom of his heart a sort of uneasiness. His son ought, under the circumstances, to have gone to the dogs. That law was laid down in all the novels, sermons, and plays he had ever read, heard, or witnessed. After receiving the cheque back, there seemed to him to be something wrong somewhere. Why had his son not gone to the dogs? But then, who could tell? He had heard, of course, in fact he had made it his business to find out, that Jo lived in St. John's Wood, that he had a little house in Wisteria Avenue, with a garden, and took his wife about with him into society. A queer sort of society, no doubt. And that they had 2 children, the little chap they called Jolly. Considering the circumstances, the name struck him as cynical, and old Jolyon both feared and disliked cynicism. And a girl called Holly, born since the marriage. Who could tell what his son's circumstances really were? He had capitalized the income he had inherited from his mother's father, and joined Lloyd's as an underwriter. He painted pictures, too, water-colours. Old Jolyon knew this, for he had surreptitiously bought them from time to time, after chancing to see his son's name signed at the bottom of a representation of the River Thames in a dealer's window. He thought them bad, and did not hang them because of the signature. He kept them locked up in a drawer. In the great opera house a terrible yearning came on him to see his son. He remembered the days when he had been wont to slide him in a brown holland suit to and fro under the arch of his legs, the times when he ran behind the boy's pony, teaching him to ride. the day when he first took him to school. He had been a loving, lovable little chap. After he went to Eton he had acquired perhaps a little too much of the desirable manner, which old Jolyon knew was only to be obtained at such places and at great expense. But he had always been companionable, always a companion, even after Cambridge, a little far off, perhaps, owing to the advantages he had received. Old Jolyon's feelings towards our public schools and varsities had never wavered, and he retained touchingly his attitude of admiration and mistrust towards a system appropriate to the highest in the land, of which he had not himself been privileged to partake. Now that June had gone and left, or as good as left him, it would have been a comfort to see his son again. Guilty of this treason to his family, his principles, his class, old Jolyon fixed his eyes on the singer. Ah, poor thing, a wretched poor thing, and the Florian a perfect stick. It was over. Ah, they were easily pleased nowadays. In the crowded street he snapped up a cab under the very nose of a stout and much younger gentleman who had already assumed it to be his own. His route lay through Pall Mall, and at the corner, instead of going through the Green Park, the cabman turned to drive up St. James's Street. Old Jolyon put his hand through the trap. He could not bear being taken out of his way. In turning, however, he found himself opposite the Hotch-Potch, and the yearning that had been secretly with him the whole evening prevailed. He called the driver to stop. He would go in and ask if Jo still belonged there. He went in. The hall looked exactly as it did when he used to dine there with Jack Herring, and they had the best cook in London. And he looked round with the shrewd, straight glance that had caused him all his life to be better served than most men. "Mr. Jolyon Forsyte still a member here?" "Yes, sir, in the club now, sir. What name?" Old Jolyon was taken aback. "His father," he said, and having spoken, he took his stand back to the fireplace. Young Jolyon, on the point of leaving the club, had put on his hat and was in the act of crossing the hall as the porter met him. He was no longer young, with hair going grey, and a face, a narrower replica of his father's, with the same large drooping moustache, decidedly worn. He turned pale. This meeting was terrible after all those years, for nothing in the world was so terrible as a scene. They met and crossed hands without a word. Then, with a quaver in his voice, the father said, "How are you, my boy?" The son answered, "How are you, Dad?" Old Jolyon's hand trembled in its thin lavender glove. "If you're going my way," he said, "I can give you a lift." And, as though in the habit of taking each other home every night, they went out and stepped into the cab. To old Jolyon it seemed that his son had grown. "More of a man altogether," was his comment. Over the natural amiability of that son's face had come a rather sardonic mask, as though he found in the circumstances of his life the necessity for armour. The features were certainly those of a Forsyte, but the expression was more like the introspective look of a student or philosopher. He had no doubt been obliged to look into himself a good deal in the course of those 15 years. To young Jolyon, the first sight of his father was undoubtedly a shock. He looked so worn and old, but in the cab he seemed hardly to have changed, still having the calm look so well remembered, still being upright and keen-eyed. "You look well, Dad." "Middling," old Jolyon answered. He was the prey to an anxiety that he found he must put into words. Having got his son back like this, he felt that he must know what was his financial position. "Jo," he said, "I should like to hear what sort of water you're in. I suppose you're in debt?" He put it this way, that his son might find it easier to confess. Young Jolyon answered in his ironical voice, "No, I'm not in debt." Old Jolyon saw that he was angry, and touched his hand. He had run a risk. It was worth it, however, and Jo had never been sulky with him. They drove on, without speaking again, to Stanhope Gate. Old Jolyon invited him in, but young Jolyon shook his head. "June's not here," said his father hastily. "Went off today in a visit. I suppose you know that she's engaged to be married?" "Already?" murmured young Jolyon. Old Jolyon stepped out, and in paying the cab fare, for the first time in his life, gave the driver a sovereign in mistake for a shilling. Placing the coin in his mouth, the cabman whipped his horse secretly on the underneath and hurried away. Old Jolyon turned the key softly in the lock, pushed open the door, and beckoned. His son saw him gravely hanging up his coat, with an expression on his face like that of a boy who intends to steal cherries. The door of the dining room was open, the gas turned low, a spirit urn hissed on the tea tray, and close to it a cynical-looking cat had fallen asleep on the dining table. Old Jolyon shooed her off at once. The incident was a relief to his feelings. He rattled his opera hat behind the animal. "She's got fleas," he said, following her out of the room. Through the door in the hall leading to the basement he called "Hist!" several times, as though assisting the cat's departure, till, by some strange coincidence, the butler appeared below. "You can go to bed, Parfitt," said old Jolyon. "I will lock up and put out." When he again entered the dining room, the cat unfortunately preceded him, with her tail in the air, proclaiming that she had seen through this manoeuvre for suppressing the butler from the first. A fatality had dogged old Jolyon's domestic stratagems all his life. Young Jolyon could not help smiling. He was very well versed in irony, and everything that evening seemed to him ironical. The episode of the cat, the announcement of his own daughter's engagement. So he had no more part or parcel in her than he had in the puss, and the poetical justice of this appealed to him. "What's June like now?" he asked. "She's a little thing," returned old Jolyon. "They say she's like me, but that's their folly. She's more like your mother. Same eyes and hair." "Ah! And she's pretty?" Old Jolyon was too much of a Forsyte to praise anything freely, especially anything for which he had a genuine admiration. "Not bad looking. A regular Forsyte chin. It'll be lonely here when she's gone, Jo." The look on his face again gave young Jolyon the shock he had felt on first seeing his father. "What will you do with yourself, Dad? I suppose she's wrapped up in him." "Do with myself?" repeated old Jolyon with an angry break in his voice. "It'll be miserable work living here alone. I don't know how it's to end. I wish to goodness—" He checked himself, and added, "The question is, what had I better do with this house?" Young Jolyon looked round the room. It was peculiarly vast and dreary, decorated with the enormous pictures of still life that he remembered as a boy. Sleeping dogs with their noses resting on bunches of carrots, together with onions and grapes lying side by side in mild surprise. The house was a white elephant, but he could not conceive of his father living in a smaller place, and all the more did it all seem ironical. In his great chair with the book-rest sat old Jolyon, the figurehead of his family in class and creed, with his white head and dome-like forehead, the representative of moderation and order and love of property, as lonely an old man as there was in London. There he sat in the gloomy comfort of the room, a puppet in the power of great forces that cared nothing for family or class or creed, but moved machine-like with dread processes to inscrutable ends. This was how it struck young Jolyon, who had the impersonal eye. The poor old dad! So this was the end, the purpose to which he had lived with such magnificent moderation: to be lonely and grow older and older, yearning for a soul to speak to. In his turn, old Jolyon looked back at his son. He wanted to talk about many things that he had been unable to talk about all these years. It had been impossible to seriously confide in June his conviction that property in the Soho quarter would go up in value, his uneasiness about that tremendous silence of Pippin, the superintendent of the new colliery company, of which he had so long been chairman, his disgust at the steady fall in American Golgothas, and even to discuss how, by some sort of settlement, he could best avoid the payment of those death duties which would follow his decease. Under the influence, however, of a cup of tea, which he seemed to stir indefinitely, he began to speak at last. A new vista of life was thus opened up, a promised land of talk, where he could find a harbour against the waves of anticipation and regret, where he could soothe his soul with the opium of devising how to round off his property, and make eternal the only part of him that was to remain alive. Young Jolyon was a good listener. It was his great quality. He kept his eyes fixed on his father's face, putting a question now and then. The clock struck 1 before old Jolyon had finished, and at the sound of its striking his principles came back. He took out his watch with a look of surprise. "I must go to bed, Joe," he said. Young Jolyon rose and held out his hand to help his father up. The old face looked worn and hollow again. The eyes were steadily averted. "Good-bye, my boy. Take care of yourself." A moment passed, and young Jolyon, turning on his heel, marched out at the door. He could hardly see. His smile quavered. Never in all the 15 years since he had first found out that life was no simple business had he found it so singularly complicated. End of Chapter 2.